Does it work? Oh, yeah. It does. Yes? J'y vais, François? On commence? All right. We're going to slowly start. Welcome, everyone. Warm greetings. Welcome to the side event called Building Solidarity for Tax, Debt, and Climate Justice, the essential role of human rights compliant climate finance. So this conversation is basically going to try to answer some of the key questions we have about the new climate finance goal. That is one, if not the main issue we want to see discussed here at COP29 in Baku. So my name is Rebecca Thyssen. I work as Global Advocacy Lead at CAN International. And maybe before we go to our amazing panel, I'd like to give you a few introduction words about what we are actually talking about when we speak about this new climate finance goal and what is at stake. So maybe first, where are we now? I guess the majority of you have heard about the 100 billion goal, which is the previous climate finance goal. Was agreed in Copenhagen 15 years ago and was anchored in the Paris Agreement 9 years ago, stating different responsibilities and different criteria for that goal to be implemented between 2020 and 2025. 2025 is the year where we'll replace that goal by a new goal in the very famous acronym of the NCQG. Right, so that's what's being discussed and normally finalized here this year. And it's actually very timely that we replace that 100 billion goal, because the least we can say is that it didn't work well for many reasons, and we hear that from our different panelists, from the fact that it was a way too low number, not reflecting the needs, not anchoring science, that it was a goal that actually increased debt crisis in the global south, because it was composed majority by loans, not based on a clear definition of climate finance, etc., etc. So you can hear the issues are major, and we need to take good lesson of that failure to build an adequate and equitable goal here in Baku. So that's where we're coming from. Where are we now? If you've been following the negotiation a little bit, you may have heard about a draft text. It's a substantive decision draft text that has been proposed by the two co-chairs that are facilitating the technical discussion. So that's maybe the first phase we're going to enter as soon as we start negotiating the new goal, is whether or not that text would be approved and agreed as a basis for the negotiation for the 2 weeks. It's important to know that we have been analyzing that text, we've been reading through it, and we find it very unbalanced, because there are things that are actually still not acceptable in that text and that we find very dangerous as a basis for negotiation. And again, we hear more about that from a panelist. So that's where we are. It's day one at COP. Everything is still very open. Everybody is very much focusing on that conversation on climate finance. So the idea here today with our panelists is try to unpack a bit more what is climate finance about at the end, and how to make sure that the new goal is not just about, very complex words in a negotiating text, but it's actually answering people's and community needs. So that's really what we want to discuss today with you. So to start and kick things off, a very simple question to you all, to all the panelists. Oh, no, first I need to introduce you. Excuse me. So, as I said, my name is Rebecca Thyssen, and with me today on the panel, I have Karine Thibault, who is the Director General of Amnesty International Belgium, Belgique francophone. We have also Lydie Nakpil, who is the coordinator of Jubilee South and the Asia Pacific Movement on Debt and Development, called APMDD, as well as the co-founder of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice, called DCJ. And here, on my left, we have Claire Nasanga, who is a veterinary doctor, climate and gender activist with Rise Up Movement and TARD Foundation. So we could not dream of a better panel to answer all the questions we have today and to understand better what is at stake and what does it mean on the ground when it comes to climate finance. So now I'm going back to my first question. So it's the first day of COP, right? What is your feeling, and really what have you been observing, how have you been preparing regarding the negotiation on climate finance? And what are your perspectives about those 2 weeks at COP29? Claire, maybe starting with you.
Oh, Thank you. Yeah, it's working. Thank you very much for the introduction and all. I'm very grateful to be at this panel. And for the first question about the negotiations around climate finance, well, that I'm really not so sure because we have not seen where it's going. But again, we remain hopeful and hope that they remain or uplift their commitments towards the fund.
Karin, how do you feel about those 2 weeks of negotiations?
I think it's the first week. I think for a lot of people, what happened with the election at the US level is really a nightmare regarding what will happen in terms of fossil fuels extraction, but also how it could influence the negotiation. And I think the discussion will be hard because we will have really to push rich countries to accept and to give a clear engagement for higher climate finance objective, and at the same time to avoid that they're hiding behind the new situation in the US. So I think it will be a hard discussion, and let's see how it goes.
Yeah, I think many of us are very worried about this next 2 weeks because we've seen for many months now how the negotiations on the NCQG has been happening, and it's been following a trend quite a few years, and that is the developed country governments not wanting to acknowledge in full their obligations to provide climate finance. So they're not even willing to acknowledge that this $100 billion pledge is so small compared to the actual needs and the actual obligations. And now they're trying to bring it in all sorts of directions instead of talking about what will they pledge in terms of public finance for the developing countries. So they want to bring in the private sector. So instead of assuming the responsibility for providing public finance, they're pointing to the private sector. And worse, they're talking about using public finance to incentivize the private sector. So this is something that we are really very much worried about. So we're really preparing to protest hard against these trends. And the other thing that's also being discussed now, being pushed by developed country governments, is this whole contributor-based idea. So they are not saying that they will acknowledge their obligations. In fact, they're pointing to others in order to provide this climate finance. Well, let us tell you from the Global South, we have been providing much more of our own money than what we are getting from overseas in order to do our climate actions and programs. At least 85% of what we are spending on climate action is coming from our own pockets. So this expanding the contributor base, what are you talking about? This contributor base, we have been assuming most of the spending for all of this time.
Thank you very much to the three of you. So I think you start to get a bit the complicated scene we are in. And indeed, we have been hearing a lot of proposition, maybe rather distraction, coming majority from developed countries. And I think that will come a bit later in the conversation. We need to be very clear how to answer those and how to re-put a clear priority in the center of the debate. But before we go a bit into the nitty-gritty of the negotiation, we wanted a bit to link the conversation about climate finance, about the new goal, to the reality on the ground, and specifically in the context of human rights. Because again, we will never emphasize this enough, those negotiations are about realities, right? About inequalities, about people's life. And so even though we are ending up fighting very hard on one word, you can never forget that it has implication in the real world as well. And we tend to forget that in those rooms, with those very horrible light and no vision of the exterior. So please, let's try to get grounded in the reality on the ground. So Claire, starting with you, how to link actually those discussions on the finance issue, on this new climate finance goal that always look very disconnected with the reality on the ground, and what can you observe in your daily work as activists in your country?
In regards to that question, for when we look at the statistics of the realities that are happening on the ground, actually the statistics are bigger than what is being portrayed. The statistics are bigger than just the numbers that they're giving us. It's actually the people on ground. It's the faces that are being impacted by the climate crisis, and how we could translate the financial discussions more to the on ground. We should ground them in a way that they are actually more connected to the stories of the people that are being affected in the communities. If you're to go back to my home country in Uganda, there is money. It's like a form of a loan that people take up, mostly female farmers. They take it up to support their work that they are doing, purchase of crops, going through all that processing until the harvest. And now imagine this farmer has faced an impact, let's say the floods, and they have washed away their crops. What are they going to do? They have no way to adapt. They can't survive. And then you have money to pay back. So we have to look at all these realities, and we should make the financial figures more related to tangible solutions. Let's say creating protective barriers, flood barriers, or giving farmers crops that are actually more drought adaptable, and maybe giving access to the families that are actually affected, to giving them access to renewable energy or cleaner energy. But if you're to look at most of the families in the global south, actually most of them can't even afford just a solar panel. So it's more than just transitioning, but how is this transitioning happening? Like, it should be made in a more fair way. Are these things affordable? So in the way that we are looking for the solution, we need financial solutions that are actually related to the stories on ground. The global south faces a lot of impacts. My country is facing floods, but we actually have less of the coverage. So if we would have more coverage of the stories of the people that are being affected on ground, if we have more coverage of their stories, maybe this would remind the decision makers that actually we have lives at stake. It's just more than just climate justice. It's social justice, it's environmental justice, and also covering human rights. Yeah, so we should look at it in that angle. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And very important to remember those connections with social, economic, finance, climate justice all together. And two very important points you made about the role of loans in the context of climate finance that are, of course, very problematic. We'll hear more about it. And the need of a climate finance definition, because otherwise the money is actually flowing in the wrong direction and not where people need it the most, as you were saying, specifically, for example, answering the needs of resilience building, etc., etc. So thank you for that. Over to you, Karin, in kind of the same question. So according to you, why is climate finance so crucial to fight against human rights violation related to climate change, and maybe building on what Claire just shared?
Yes, I mean, it's obvious for the people who are here, but I think saying as Amnesty that climate change is already causing a lot of violation of human rights, I think it's important to say it. You said it a little bit just before, that the right to house, the right to water, the right to food is affected. And I think also for the first time in the story of humanity, we have seen empire declining, we have seen empire who have failed, but for the first time of the history, we know if we cross a certain line, at a certain point, there are certain countries who will disappear. And so for human rights defenders, as Amnesty, it means that we know that, for example, Pacific Island, they will disappear, we will cross this critical line of the 1.5 degrees. So it means that people will lose the right to nationality, a right to territory, a right to culture. So it has direct impact. And so why is climate finance so important? It's because it's clearly the way that you are answering the question of the climate debt. And the climate debt, it's all in the Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement, you have the ambition, but you have also the recognition of the climate debt. Why some countries, as Belgium, as Benelux, was our country are rich now, it's because we were able to use fossil fuels in our history. We make an industrial revolution. And this discussion is now, how do we do with countries who are now suffering, as you said, the most about climate change, but who are not responsible for it, who so little. And that's the huge question. And I think when we look to the story of what happened with the first financial goal and the discussion of the 100 billion, I'm right, no? Because English is not my first language, so I'm always struggling with it. it's the fact that it's a little bit like you have a neighbor in your house, and this neighbor is responsible for water damage in your house. And this neighbor is saying to you, yeah, I'm responsible for it, but you know what? I will answer to the water damage I made to you by a loan. I offer you a loan and you will pay it with interest like in a bank. This is something that you would never accept. If a neighbor would say, I'm responsible for the water damage, but you know what? I'm going to give you a loan and you will pay an interest on it. And I think this is what happened with the situation now. It's that a lot of country and North country, it's only by loan that they are providing climate finance. You explain a little bit, but for organizations as us, we see that this is a huge issue, and I think you will tell us how is it a huge issue, because it means that some countries, they are choosing between paying the debt that they have of building an hospital, of being able to answer to people who are suffering from floods. And so that's exactly where you see that austerity policy that we see in the North, but they are really more important in the global South. Austerity policies, they are really harming human rights, the right to health, the right to education. So this is where I think finance is so crucial. And as you said, it's about the quantity of finance, so the objective based on the needs and on human rights approach. And it's also based on the fact that there is a climate debt, and it has to be also a quality finance based on grants and coming from public finance. And that's something I think will be a key outcome from this COP. And we hope to have another solution than what was offered in the last COP.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think, again, we're coming back to the role of loans that are totally contradictory with the idea of climate justice, climate debt, and reparation. And just for your information, in the context of the 100 billion goal, it's 70% of loans. So it's not just, an annex problematic. It's central to the conversation. It is, of course, very linked to debt justice and the current debt crisis the Global South is facing. So, Lydie, maybe you can explain a bit more the connection between the two.
Well, I think it's very important in building all these connections to remember about our colonial history. Because one of the things that is not discussed in discussions about debt is, why is the South borrowing so much? And that has to be traced back in our colonial history, because our economies in the South are primarily the way they are because we have been colonized. Our natural resources have been plundered. We have been left with economies that are oriented towards exporting cheap natural resources and semi-finished products for the global markets and for the former colonizer countries. And that now that we're impoverished countries, because all of our resources are flowing out, they turn around and say, here, let me lend your money. So this analogy that she talked about is very important, and I extend it further. It's not just that your neighbor is responsible for the water damage in your house. Your neighbor is responsible why you cannot even afford to have proper housing or decent housing, why your lands have been taken away, why your livelihoods are paying so little that you can't even survive, you can't even support your family, and then they cause further damage to your house, and then they turn around and lend you money. And that is why the South has been so saddled with huge debts, because we don't keep enough of our wealth inside our countries because of the way the global economic structures are the way they are in relations. And now we're saddled with huge debts. We're paying all the global South altogether more than $400 to $500 billion of debt service every year. And to top it all, we're going to have to deal with all this loss and damage from the climate impacts. And now they're offering more loans that will drive us deeper into debt. So we're not going to recover from it. It's also unjust why we are the way we are. And then they turn around and they said, we will lend you money, but you have to pay us back with interest. So these are all connected. We're saying we need reparations. And these reparations can be in the form of loans, because it's really contrary to the spirit and the intent of reparations. We need climate finance. And mind you, that climate finance is not just about saving our people. It's saving the entire planet because mitigation actions, for instance, in the north is not enough to cover up all this, to compensate for all the greenhouse gases that have been emitted into the atmosphere by primarily the global north. The US alone has emitted more than twice that of China and India for the last 150 years. And then they keep finger pointing at all these big countries, forgetting about history. And it's not just history. What they have emitted is still there up in the atmosphere for the last 150 years. So what we are asking is not just climate finance. They have to cancel all these debts. This is not in payment for climate finance. This is in payment for the fact that these debts are not primarily because we benefited from it, because these debts were borrowings because they have been impoverished us, and these debts have come with conditions to make our economies even more useful for the global north countries, conditionalities that have opened up our doors for more private investments from the north. So yeah, all of these are related. Sorry, I'm very angry about this situation because we keep hearing the same arguments from the negotiators from the global north, from developed countries. And the worst is they're making us feel as if we're begging for assistance. We are not begging for assistance. We're demanding payment for reparations. And we're demanding climate finance in behalf of the whole humanity, not just for ourselves or our families. Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks. No, they're the one who are actually being indebted with a climate debt, and they need to repay it. So it's very clear. So we have climate finance conversation, but of course in parallel there is the whole debt justice issue and the debt cancellation need, and that's also happening in other UN fora. That's also very important to follow. Another important point is of course the role of loans vis-à-vis grants, but also the role of public finance vis-à-vis the private sector, and we see more and more attempt to actually crawl in the private sector in the conversation to, of course, dilute responsibility at the end. Because if you have more money coming, you would basically need to provide less. However, the role of public finance is critical to ensure a just and equitable transition for loss and damage, clearly, for adaptation, but also for mitigation and energy. Many countries tend to see energy as being okay with private finance, okay with loans, but a just energy transition that's accessible, democratic, needs also public finance. So transitioning to that and the need of public finance, what we've been hearing in the room is that there is not enough money. Budgets are constrained, we have liquidity squeeze, it's complicated, our finance ministry won't accept that much money, So, as civil society, we've been asking for trillions of public finance for this new goal to be finally adequate regarding the needs. And it's not regarding the needs because we made it up, right? It's based on science and literature. So we need those trillions. It has been very clear. And the answer we got is there is not enough money. Well, I'm sure all of you are very convinced about that. There is a lot of money. There is plenty of money flowing around. It's just going in the wrong direction or staying in the wrong hands. So maybe now we can dip a bit deeper into that and see where could we find this money and convince Global North government that they have the funds to actually live up to their responsibility and obligation. So Karin, going to you. So it looks enormous. Talking about the trillion is actually not that much. How can we find that money? What avenue can we explore?
Okay, so perhaps as you said, I think if they're afraid of the sum that we are asking, they should be afraid about the fact that it's based on needs. So it's based on reality. You should be afraid because this is the reality we are going to face and we're already facing. One thing. The other thing is we already had the capacity to find this kind of money. Just look at what we did about COVID. About COVID, it was 16 trillion that we were able, as Global North, to fight against a disease. So that's one thing. Another thing, I think, it's a discussion about fossil fuel subsidies, where we still have a lot of public money, public finance going to support fossil fuels extraction, fossil fuel distribution, consumption. So this is something that we are asking a lot of time in a lot of COPs to say we should end fossil fuel subsidies. And that's perhaps something we should redirect this public finance to go directly to climate finance to support and to respond to the needs who are in the poorest countries and poorest communities. The other thing, I'm not naive, but Elon Musk should have 1 trillion in 3 years. His fortune, and I think he will be really rich. If you're just looking to the trend, he could be really rich in some years. I'm not naive thinking that Elon Musk will give this money to climate finance, but it gives a sense about the fact that there are one person in the world of people who has a lot of money in their bank account. And this is something that we could use to have a tax on billionaires to have more money for support climate finance. There are also some proposals are on the table about maritime transport, about air transport, on this kind of stuff. So we have capacity to find this money, and we have capacity to make it. And I just wanted to say, I think there is another principle we will fight for it in this COP. It's the polluters pay principle. We were able, when the crisis came in Europe, for example, when there was a rate of inflation was really high, we were able to make. It was a provisory, it was not a permanent windfall tax. It was a windfall tax on fossil fuels companies, but we decided that it wouldn't be permanent. That's something we're asking for, to have a permanent windfall tax on fossil fuels company to help rebuild what they destroy and what they're still destroying. So there is a lot of, I think, capacity and levies to use to find this money. I just want to add something on the importance of public finance. It has to do with accountability. For human rights defenders as Amnesty, it's super important that we have a mechanism of accountability. And the accountability, it comes only with public authorities, with public governments. That's why it's so important to have public finance. If we're just talking about private finance, let's look to the future. I imagine in the future that in 3 or 4 or 5 years, the private sector is more interested in artificial intelligence. It's okay, you understand me? Okay, great. And not interested in clean economy. What are you going to do? You have no capacity to redirect these private flows. So that's the discussion also we need to have. So that's why it's so important in terms of accountability to have a public finance in climate finance and to have grants, because this is a question of accountability, visibility, and as you said, a clear definition. Because until now, it's quite unclear what is under the label of climate finance and what is not under the label of climate finance.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I guess we need a clear definition. That's sure. From what I understood from you, it's more about a matter of political will rather than liquidity squeeze or budget scarcity. There is also a thing important to know is that the private sector is not party to the UNFCCC. So it's parties, countries, governments that have to negotiate and implicate their budget into the conversation on the new goal. So you were mentioning the need of making polluters pay, and I think that's very important. You were referring to super rich, ultra rich people such as Elon Musk, but there are many others that could be taxed and providing more money to climate action development. But Claire, what do you see as other avenue to make polluters pay, and who could they be?
So about making the polluters pay, so as earlier as she said that there is the polluters pay principle, they would make polluters pay, but actually making it, putting stronger regulations and maybe penalties for those that don't comply to this. Because we have seen NDCs, they have talked about NDCs, and everyone should contribute. Every country has their various goals that they contribute to that. But there is actually no penalty. Like, if a country doesn't fulfill their NDCs, nothing is going to be done. Like, they won't be held accountable. So I feel like they should put a way that we could hold the polluters accountable. They should put penalties in case they don't pay up for what they have to pay up for. And also, a global fund could actually be put in place just to finance or support the countries that are being affected, because the Global South is responsible for the list of the emissions. So these polluters could actually put up a global fund that is financing, and maybe this would hold them financially accountable to the issues that they are also, to the damage that they are causing in regards to the climate crisis that we are facing. But if we are to look at that in also that sector, you also realize that we, the general public or the observers, we actually have a lot of work that we could do to make the polluters pay. We cannot make them pay by maybe putting laws against them, but we could boycott their products. They produce a lot of products, like they could sell to us, let's say, a company like Coca-Cola giving us their drinks. As a child, I grew up when I really loved Coca-Cola. I really loved soda. Like, we were children, it is something very good for you, like Christmas celebration. But when we grow up and you find out like they are causing a lot of impacts, according to statistics in Uganda, in these urban settings, each meal that you take actually contains about 4% of microplastics. And with the continuous intake of this, what is going to happen tomorrow? How is it impacting the people? So they're actually causing more damage than the solutions or the products that they're selling to us. They're not giving us actually the soda to drink. They're giving us the plastic that is increasing the pollution and contributing yet again to the climate crisis. So we as the general public, we could actually create a bigger impact by boycotting their products, receiving to intake what they're selling to us. And with that, it would remind them to comply and maybe produce something that is more eco-friendly and maybe pay up for their issues.
Thank you for that really good point. We talk about accountability of governments, but of course the private sector can't be left off the hook, and we need those companies to be held accountable for the emission, the pollution, the damages they are causing. So that's a very important point as well. So we've been now hearing how to raise more money, how to provide more money to the new climate finance goal. And I think the answer is clear. Money is there. It's just a matter of looking for it and find the right sources. But it's not only about raising more money. That's, of course, one big phase of the conversation we are at now. But it's also about transforming the current financial system linked to debt, to tax, to economic injustices. And so what are really the key avenues we could do so? Because the NCQG is something, but it's not happening in a vacuum, right? And there is a wider system that's also responsible for the climate crisis and for the damages.
I think for that, we need to make sure that we're acting in our countries as well as globally, because we know that a lot of the structures and relations that we're seeking to change are global, but it also has their roots in how our national financial and economic structures have been oriented for all this many time. So nationally, for instance, there's a number of key arenas and initiatives where we must act together. There's transformation of the international tax regime that's being pursued, and one very important opportunity which we won as international civil society movements is the negotiations for the UN Tax Convention. And it's at a very critical point. We are pushing governments to accept the terms of reference that has been negotiated and now has to be agreed upon. And this is all up now at the United Nations level. There is a process for these negotiations that are taking place. So it's very important for us to challenge and push our government so that the efforts for this international tax convention moves forward. There is also another effort, and that is an initiative coming from civil society and some governments. It hasn't quite gone as advanced as the tax, but an effort to have a UN framework convention on debt resolution. So there's that proposal coming from a few countries at this point, governments, and very much supported by civil society for this framework convention on debt to be worked out, to be drafted and negotiated, and it's going to be one of the key topics in the UN financing for development process also taking place. There will be the UN FFD4 taking place next year, a preparatory committee meeting that will be taking place in January. And this is the conference, I believe, is happening in Spain sometime in June. So then you have also, of course, other avenues like the WTO, where we are seeking changes in at least two arenas. One is the international property rights regime, which has been a barrier to the transfer of technology for climate solutions. And then also another arena, which doesn't involve just the WTO, but also the World Bank, and this is the settlement of investment disputes between states and corporations, because there's a great deal of issues that will be arising from existing contracts that will stand in the way of a swift transition out of fossil fuels, because there are many contracts from mining to production and so on and so forth. So these are some of the arenas for the key changes we are seeking in the financial as well as economic architecture. And this is just the beginning. I mean, there's many others, and it will be another forum just to discuss that. Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's very important to connect those dots so that we can see the particularity of the NCQG, but also its limits, right? The NCQG is about finance from developed to developing countries. We think and we push for this goal to be about public finance, about grants-based finance. But as you heard, this goal won't solve the whole climate crisis. This goal won't solve the whole climate debt. So those connections with the wider financial and economic architecture are really key, because we are fighting here, but we also need to fight another day to have tax justice, debt justice, economic justice, and work also on the unfair trade rules. So it's important, I think, because when we are at COP specifically now, we're just focusing on those texts, but they are linked to other very important processes. And I think it will also influence the way we see those negotiations and what we can achieve with the NCQG and what we don't need to talk about in that context. So now we are going in the last phase of our discussion and going a bit more specifically on what needs to happen this week, next week. Where do we need to land at COP29? So you've been understanding, hopefully, thanks to our amazing panelists, why climate finance is about human rights, is about people's life, is about inequalities, why it is linked to the need of more public money. We can raise this public money. It's about political will and making polluters pay. But now let's see specifically what are the main priorities we need to fight for collectively for those 2 weeks. So maybe, Lydie, coming back to you, I was quickly alluding to the 100 billion figure and all the failures we saw with that agreement. So what would be the key messages we really need to emphasize based on the lesson we saw there and what needs to happen to correct course with the NCQG?
I think the most important thing is our push to keep the NCQG process focused on, first, ensuring that what we're talking about here primarily is public finance. Of course, there is need for the private sector to participate in this entire process of addressing climate change. And of course, there has to be private finance. But the NCQG process is about public finance, because we are talking about the obligations of global north governments or developed country governments to the rest of the world, which is the developing countries. So this has to be about public finance. And second, we're talking about quantum as well. No? So we're talking about not billions, but trillions. There's a number of proposals going around. Of course, we in civil society are saying it's at least 5 trillion. And believe me, we didn't pull this number out of a hat. We have a basis in many, many studies that have been made about climate finance needs for both adaptation, mitigation, but beyond that, also loss and damage, and the finance needed to ensure a just transition, because all those four need to be covered. And the 5 trillion is a low estimate of what is needed. And we're talking about public finance. So those are two things. We need trillions, not billions, and we need to keep it focused on public finance. What they're trying to do is to shift the focus to many different layers. They're talking about multi-layers now in the NCQG process, talking about public and private, talking about loans and grants and other what they call innovative instruments. We're not saying we don't need any of that, but we're saying this process should be about talking about public finance delivery.
Thanks. Very important point about the structure of that goal and not ending up in a very complex and blurry composition of the layers, as we call it, but just focus basically on mobilization and particularly provision of public finance, as the Paris Agreement said. I just invite everyone to reread the Paris Agreement, specifically Article 9, and we have everything we need to build an efficient and equitable goal. So let's try to not overcomplicate things and just go back to the basics. So going to you, Claire, you were referring to, of course, the concrete impacts of climate change. So on that specific fight of loss and damage to be included in the new goal, what would be your main priorities and messages?
So my main priorities for the establishing of the loss and damage finance. We all know that the loss and damage finance was actually was operationalized the previous scope that we were at, but various countries have been actually channeling their money from the Green Environment Fund and the Green Climate Fund towards the loss and damage fund. But to me, my goal, or what I would want to see, is establishing a fund for all the specific areas, because also the GEF is also as important as the loss and damage fund. So they should establish a personal loss and damage fund without channeling money from elsewhere, and also they should put the money in the bag, because we all know the $100 billion that goal that was established. So countries should fulfill their commitments and actually put the money in the pot, so that it actually supports the most affected communities, the most affected areas, like the small island states, indigenous groups, and countries that are actually not as developed. And also, the World Bank will be the one hosting the loss and damage fund. And with this, will it be as transparent for the money to reach to these various groups? So it should actually be made transparent that anyone who is in those areas that are affected can actually access the finance. Loss and damage finance should be urgent, and it's an urgent issue. If I'm hit by a flood today, will I be able to access the fund? So we should also look into the bureaucracy of the loss and damage money that will be hosted by the World Bank. The World Bank having the money, will it be as easily accessible by a country, let's say, that is facing impacts of the climate crisis? If I'm hit today by a flood, will I get the help that I need? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Very important point on access. Of course, the money has to be accessible. It's just not about, big pot of money that remains there and nobody can, or actually community cannot benefit from it. It's about the role of UNFCCC climate funds. I think that's a very important fight we need to pin down too, because the tendency now is to channel money through MDBs, for example, or external actors where we have no control and no transparency, as you were saying. And of course, parties agreed to establish, as you were saying, the loss and damage fund, or the fund to respond to loss and damage now. So why not actually making loss and damage a clear pillar of the new goal? That's a clear question, and you're totally right to flag that, because it's just paradoxal to have agreed on a fund and then you just want to keep it empty. Karine, now to you. You're working intensively also with your previous job on advocating to develop countries to do more, to be more ambitious and fighting for climate justice. So what would you tell them today, tomorrow, and in the 2 coming weeks to actually achieve and adopt an ambitious goal that works for people and the planet?
Globally, you think about developed countries?
Targeting developed countries specifically.
Yeah, perhaps just looking about the Belgium situation. I mean, we are in the Benelux, so it's quite important. I discussed with colleagues this morning to have more information about the climate finance in Belgium. And I think one of the things that we could push Belgium is, we said it, loss and damage is not inside the climate finance. On adaptation, it was all the time not so much in regarding mitigation. But Belgium, in terms of adaptation, of finance for adaptation, is quite good. So it's like 60 to 70% of the climate finance is going to adaptation. That's something we could say, you have to be a champion on that. You have to convince the others that you have to have loss and damage inside the climate finance with a clear goal, to have a clear accountability on that, and you have to have a clear goal on adaptation, also on public finance. That's something you can give. The other thing we discuss is about grants versus loans, and that's Belgium is quite good on grants. It's like 60% to 70% who are on grants, so that's something you can be a champion on that. Why? But the other thing where we are not good at all is the numbers. we are really low. We are really low, and that's something I think we need to convince them. First, we need to say again, as civil society from the developed countries, that there is a climate debt, that there is an history, as you said. Just like looking to the history, why we are rich now, it's because it's based on this history on greenhouse gas emissions. That's something you have to answer this climate debt. The other thing I think we have to convince them that we are talking about public finance and not the private sector. Okay, private sector can come, but that's not our primarily objective for this COP. We want to have public finance, and you have to deliver on that. And the last point, I think, it's the link between ambition and the situation with the climate finance. More and more, I think what happened in Spain, in Valence, the floods, the people who lost their home, who lost their life, and this kind of stuff, we see the result of the climate disaster and the climate disruption. And this is what is happening more and more in the south, and as you said, without the capacity to answer it. And also in the north, if you want to have ambition, which is something that I think the global north, not everyone, but some of them, like the European zone is pushing for that, you need to have climate finance. It's linked. It's the same story. You cannot have one without having the second. So I think it would be like the discussion we need to push to developed countries. And also look what happened in Valence. These last days, there were marches and mobilization from people who suffered the flood against, for example, far-right parties who decide to cut, for example, the emergency unit, and who are responsible for people's deaths. So I mean, looking what's happening, you need to have an answer to that, and it will happen also in your country if you're not answering to this demand, linking climate finance with ambition. So that's something that I think we will have to push for it. It will not be easy, and I think we have a little bit more of climato-sceptic people going to the power, not only in the United States but also in Europe countries. But we have to push for more responsibility and to push as civil society to ask them for accountability. They didn't meet the first goal. They have to meet now the ambition goal that is based on needs, and that's important to ask them that.
Thank you. Yeah, and so also very much about responsibility and not shying away and not proposing hypocritical solution. So thanks for that. Maybe I will try to wrap up quickly and just give you kind of a checklist of what needs to happen within the 2 coming weeks, so that all together we can make sure that we are in the rooms or we are outside the rooms, and we increase pressure and we make our priorities loud and clear. So I'm just rephrasing what panelist says, trying to at least. So one, it's about public finance. And where that public finance needs to happen is in a public provision core at the center of the goal. And when we say a core, we imagine a core of a mango, for example, not of an apple, if you know what I mean. Because developed countries are saying, oh, we agree with a core, but that core could be very small, only for specific countries, and for example, only for adaptation. We are talking about the core because it's the basis of the conversation, right? That core will cover adaptation, mitigation. We also need public finance for mitigation, and of course include loss and damage. That core will prioritize UNFCCC climate funds for accountability, for transparency. That core will prioritize heavily grants. We can't afford to have a new climate finance goal that's actually a debt burden to the global south. Why do we focus on this? Because it's about quality of finance. And here I call everyone to be very mindful about the big figures, the big numbers we're going to hear as we go, you know. On the side of developed countries, we haven't been hearing any numbers as of yet, but it will come at some point. And we're going to hear, you know, maybe a big figure that's in the trillion, but actually meaningless in terms of sources, in terms of tracking, in terms of accountability, transparency. So don't let yourself fooled by the number only. Also look at where it's coming from, who is responsible for it, and does it answer the needs on the ground. We heard also that we have the means to get to the trillion, so I think that's an easy one. It has to be transparent, and when we say transparent, Karine alluded to this, we need to have a clear definition of what we're talking about. Just for the record, without the definition of climate finance, what happened under the 100 billion goal, ice cream shops were accounted and reported as climate finance. So it's just not, you know, an anecdotic solution that, oh, why not having a definition? Without definition, anything and everything can be accounted as climate finance. we need a definition. We also need an exclusion list because, again, otherwise, fossil fuel finance, loans at market rate will also be accounted, reported as climate finance. And again, if you heard our panelists, we are in the situation of a climate debt. We are talking about reparation, so that's of course not acceptable. And finally, I think we didn't really speak about that, but I would just add it. We also need to have a clear time frame for that goal and make sure that within 5 years, we are able to review it to ensure it's still anchored in the needs and the priorities of developing countries, just as the Paris Agreement said. And finally, we all know, and I think we heard it really clearly, it's about responsibility. So this goal is about responsibility from developed to developing countries. That's the basis. And again, we have a very good article in the Paris Agreement that said that out very clearly. So I think it's just, it looks maybe complicated, but we have all the demands clear and we know what we came here to fight for. So hopefully we can do that together. So number matters, but not any numbers and not any type of goal. So with that, I think we have some time to answer some questions.
And the microphone if someone wants one.
Logistic. Yes. Do we have any question in the room? They were all so clear.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for that amazing discussion. Mine may not really be a question, but it's a bit of a supplement to what most of the panelists have said. For example, one of the panelists talked about us having to have loss and damage, having its own money, and also it to be prompt. Because remember, this is a disaster. Disasters don't wait, and the money should be easily available. The moment someone gets a disaster today, they should be able to have that money within like the shortest time possible, because the more we lag, the more impacts we have. And then also, you see that in the adaptation fund, we currently had funds with a 100 billion goal, but realize we need around 6 times what we have in the adaptation fund. And also the bit of saying the money is not there, I may not really agree, because the fact that we could get money for COVID, why can't we get money for climate finance? The money is there, but the priorities are just diverted. But if all our priorities came to climate change, climate action, I'm sure we can be able to have the finances that we need. And also you find that you talked about the definition of the goal. True, if the goal is just left to be ambiguous, like you talked about the ice cream shops that are counted as climate finance, you'll find that money, for example, we are getting loans on a certain project and that's climate finance. But those loans even they're not concessional, they have very big interests, which makes the finance a bit haphazard. So I would think, just like most of the panelists have said and you've echoed, it would be very good that before we go to arguing about what should not be in the text, for example, right now we talked about how we need to have the right text, the right modifications before we go into the negotiations. Let's make sure that we look at the priorities. What's the definition? What's the quantum? Developing countries are talking about the trillions. How can we get the trillions? The public finance. I feel all that should come out really clearly and we get the goal that we want here. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very good points. I don't know if you want to react to. No, we all agree, I guess. Yeah, we do all agree. Thank you. Any other reflection, questions, comment? We have two. And Larry?
Yeah, thanks so much for really clear discussion of everything. But I'm just wondering, if you have any more reflections about how we can actually build solidarity among the public and at a civil society level between Global North and Global South to say, this needs to happen, but it's not actually we're not expecting people, working people in the Global North to put their money in their pockets, to pay for these things. Because I think, looking what's happened with the US election, people are concerned about, the economy and their own economy. So how do we build that solidarity across the world to say this is what needs to happen as a way to push developed countries to, actually do what they need to do?
Very good question. I'll take Larry's one and then we go back to the panel. You have one too?
There have been a lot of protests in Europe against the East African crude oil pipeline, the ECOP project by Total Energy. But the Ugandan government has said that this potentially could contribute 20% to Uganda's GDP. So, it's great if we can block this project, but if we don't provide any kind of compensation, is that fair to the Ugandan people? So how do we block this very bad project for the climate, but at the same time provide for a just transition?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good question about how to keep fossil fuel in the ground, but ensure that there is clear and compensation for that. You had a question, Madam Chu? I'm taking them and then going back to the panel.
I had a question. I wanted to how much money will go to each LDC? What if there's some LDCs that do not have bankable solution projects? How will they get this money? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we have three questions. One about global solidarity and how to build a common narrative between Global North, Global South. One about the ECOP project, but I think it's maybe a wider conversation on how to ensure we keep fossil fuels in the ground and what kind of compensation would be needed and how much money would be needed for LDC. So I don't know who wants to take which one, or all of you can.
I'll comment on the first and the third, and I'll leave the ECOP question to somebody from Uganda. First of all, I think there has to be much more communication between civil society groups in the north and in the south so that we can get together. There's already a lot of communication, of course, on those campaigning actively on climate finance, but we need wider efforts so that we can get together and come to a common understanding, because we from the south certainly don't want climate finance being delivered at the expense of working people, families, low-income communities, people of color, women in the north. We need the corporations and elites in the north to pay these reparations because they're the ones that owe us, not the ordinary people in the north. And the governments are the ones that have the power to make that happen. That's why we're holding global north governments accountable for that to happen. But we need to be campaigning together and having the same demands and calls together on the understanding that all this is actually for people everywhere. There's that, spoke about this, but it's really important to emphasize. We are not asking climate finance just for ourselves. The climate action that we must deliver in the South is necessary for the whole world to succeed in stopping climate change. So we're doing this also for all of us. And in terms of the third question, we need to really work at making sure that these channels of delivery of climate finance are democratic, are ensuring that there is equitable allocation for all countries and that there is easy access. So we also would like to invite all of you not just to be active in these negotiations at the COP, but to also engage very strongly the Green Climate Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund, and all the other funds that have been set up as channels. And we must refuse for climate finance to be channeled through undemocratic institutions like the World Bank, where the rich countries have a lot more votes and they become instruments for the governments of the rich countries to pick and choose where this finance will go to, and they use it for very political purposes. And they have been using this to divide us and rule over us for many, many years. They've always used this promise of aid, for instance, to divide the G77 in these negotiations. That's why we're also talking to our own governments. They must hold up and hold the line on this and not, for unities to collapse at the end of the day. So we must fight for these kinds of institutions, because we're not saying that once the climate finance is delivered, that's it. That's already, we can relax. No, we have to make sure that this climate finance is properly used. And it's not only these channels, we must hold our own governments in the South accountable, because there's also a lot of danger that this money falls into the wrong hands or used for the wrong purposes. So there's not much rest for us, is there? Because we have to fight in all the fronts. But that's the reality of it.
So, yeah, about the question for the EACOP, the crude oil line, the crude oil, the oil pipeline. Okay. So for that, on stopping it, whether it would be actually affecting Uganda's economy or benefiting it, what most people don't know actually is that that whole project, Uganda as a country only holds about 15% of the shares, with Total Energies holding about 62% of the shares. And you see, Total is actually a French company with a diverse network of its ownership. This means that the project is actually not really helping Uganda as so much. Like, it's not going to create so much for the country, and it being created or not happening or being stopped doesn't impact the country as much. But the project happening in Uganda is actually affecting a lot of livelihoods. They are displacing communities, animals in the world are being affected, and all that. So with this, stopping the pipeline is actually helping Uganda as a country in the longer run, because this is benefiting someone else, not even in Uganda. Yeah, so I think we should stay on course and look to ways of actually aiding the project of the EACOP instead of supporting it, because as a country we don't benefit as much. It's just a cover that's making you think that you're going to benefit, but really nothing much is being added to the country.
Thank you very much. Karin, do you want to answer? No, you good? Final round. Any burning question, comments? No? Final remarks? Okay. Thank you everyone for your great question, great comments. Thank you for the amazing panelists for setting the scene so clearly. So just remember, we have 2 weeks to fight. It's going to be a very hard fight, but we are well prepared. We know what we need, so now it's really the moment to push and to make sure we don't accept any weak or fake deal at the end. Please remember that. So thank you all and have a very good day.